Every day, millions of people surrender their safety to systems they don't understand, operated by strangers they've never met. We climb into metal tubes that hurtle through tunnels deep beneath the earth. We board buses that carry us through neighborhoods where we don't belong. We trust our lives to schedules, to maintenance crews, to the assumption that today will be just like yesterday. But what happens when those assumptions crumble? What happens when the familiar becomes foreign? When the routine becomes a trap? When the very infrastructure we depend upon turns against us? Public transportation strips away our illusions of control. We become passengers, literally and figuratively, carried along by forces beyond our influence. We're surrounded by strangers whose thoughts we cannot read, whose intentions we cannot know. We're trapped in confined spaces with no escape, dependent on systems that could fail at any moment. Tonight, we explore the dark possibilities that lurk beneath the surface of our daily commutes. These are the nightmares that could be waiting for you tomorrow morning when you step onto that platform, when you climb those stairs, when you hear the doors close behind you. These are the horrors that ride the rails with us, that idle in the engine, that whisper in the screech of brakes against steel. Welcome aboard. The 47 bus was supposed to stop running at midnight, but here it was at 2:17 a.m., doors hissing open like some mechanical serpent, inviting me inside. I'd been waiting at this godforsaken stop for over an hour, watching my phone battery die as I called cab after cab that never came. The rain had soaked through my jacket, through my shirt, all the way to my skin, and I was shivering so hard my teeth were chattering. So when those doors opened, and that warm yellow light spilled out onto the wet pavement, I didn't ask questions. I just climbed aboard. The bus driver wore the standard Metro Transit uniform, but something about him seemed off. His cap was pulled low, casting shadows across his face, and when he glanced at me in the mirror, I caught a glimpse of eyes that seemed too bright, too alert for someone working the graveyard shift. "Where to?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "Downtown," I said, fumbling for my transit card. "The financial district." He nodded and waved me back without waiting for payment. "Take any seat you like. It's going to be a long ride." The bus was nearly empty, just me and maybe 4 other passengers scattered throughout the seats. There was an elderly woman near the front, clutching a worn leather purse and staring straight ahead with glassy eyes. Behind her sat a businessman in a wrinkled suit, his briefcase balanced on his lap, also staring forward with that same vacant expression. Near the back, a teenage girl slouched against the window, earbuds in, but I noticed she wasn't moving to any music. I chose a seat in the middle, far enough from the others to feel comfortable, but close enough to the exits to make a quick getaway if needed. Not that I expected trouble. I'd ridden public transportation in this city for years without incident. But something about this particular bus, this particular night, made my skin crawl. The doors closed with a pneumatic sigh, and we lurched forward into the empty streets. At first, everything seemed normal. We followed the usual route down Market Street, past the closed shops and darkened office buildings. The rain streaked down the windows in rivulets, distorting the streetlights into abstract smears of color. The bus's heater hummed quietly, filling the air with the scent of diesel and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. But as we continued downtown, I began to notice things that didn't add up. We'd been driving for at least 20 minutes, but we were still on Market Street. The same shops, the same buildings, the same bus stops kept sliding past the windows. It was as if we were caught in some kind of loop, traveling the same few blocks over and over again. I pulled out my phone to check our location, but the screen remained black. Dead battery. I tried to remember how much charge it had when I'd gotten on the bus, but my thoughts felt strangely fuzzy, like I was thinking through cotton. "Excuse me," I called to the driver. "Are we taking a detour?" He glanced at me in the mirror, and this time I got a better look at his face. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and there were dark circles under his eyes that looked less like fatigue and more like decay. When he smiled, his teeth seemed too sharp. "No detour," he said. "We're right on schedule, but we've been on Market Street for—" "Look around you," he interrupted. "Do any of your fellow passengers seem concerned?" I turned to look at the other riders. The elderly woman was still staring straight ahead, her purse clutched tight in her arthritic hands. The businessman hadn't moved from his position, briefcase still balanced on his lap. The teenage girl continued to lean against the window, motionless. That's when I noticed none of them were breathing. The woman's chest wasn't rising and falling. The businessman's shoulders weren't moving with the rhythm of respiration. The girl's body was completely still, not even the tiny movements we make unconsciously when we're alive. I stood up abruptly, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Stop the bus. I want to get off." The driver chuckled, a sound like grinding metal. "I'm afraid that's not possible. We're between stops." "I don't care about stops. Pull over." But even as I said it, I realized there were no stops. We were still on Market Street, but the bus stops had vanished. The sidewalks stretched endlessly in both directions, empty and featureless. The buildings lining the street were identical, their windows dark and lifeless. I stumbled toward the front of the bus, grabbing seat backs for support as the vehicle swayed and lurched. "Let me off. Let me off right now." "Sit down, please," the driver said calmly. "We'll be arriving at your destination soon." "My destination is downtown. We should have been there 20 minutes ago." "Your destination," he said, turning to face me fully, "is wherever I say it is." His face was wrong. The skin hung loose around his skull, and his eyes were sunken so deep they looked like empty sockets. When he opened his mouth, I saw row after row of needle-sharp teeth, and his breath smelled like rotting meat. I backed away, my hands pressed against my mouth to keep from screaming. The other passengers had turned to look at me now, and I saw that they weren't just motionless, they were dead. The woman's face was gray and mottled, her eyes clouded with cataracts. The businessman's skin had a waxy, embalmed quality, and dark fluid leaked from the corners of his mouth. The teenage girl's neck was bent at an impossible angle, her head lolling to one side. "Welcome to the night bus," the driver said, his voice now a harsh whisper. "Final destination, nowhere." I ran toward the back of the bus, desperate to find another exit, but the rear door was sealed shut. There was no emergency handle, no window that would open. I was trapped. The bus began to accelerate, and through the windows, I watched the city blur past at impossible speeds. The buildings stretched upward like reaching fingers, their windows becoming eyes that tracked our movement. The street beneath us cracked and buckled, revealing glimpses of something vast and dark underneath. I pressed myself against the back wall, hyperventilating. The dead passengers had begun to move, turning in their seats to face me. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes controlled by a drunk puppeteer. "Don't be afraid," the woman croaked, her voice like rustling leaves. "It doesn't hurt after the first few minutes. You'll like it here," the businessman added, black fluid dripping from his lips. "No more schedules, no more appointments, no more deadlines." The girl said nothing, but her broken neck made horrible clicking sounds as she tried to turn her head. I closed my eyes and pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out their voices, their movements, the sound of the bus's engine as it carried us deeper into whatever hell this was. But I could still hear the driver humming tunelessly, could still feel the vehicle swaying beneath my feet. When I opened my eyes again, we were no longer on Market Street. We were traveling through a landscape of twisted metal and broken glass, past structures that defied physics and geometry. The sky above us was the color of old blood, and things with too many limbs skittered across the windows, leaving trails of viscous fluid in their wake. "Next stop," the driver announced cheerfully, "eternity." The bus shuddered to a halt, and the doors opened with that same pneumatic hiss. But instead of pavement, there was only darkness beyond the threshold, a void so complete it seemed to swallow light itself. "End of the line," the driver said. "Everyone off." The dead passengers began to rise from their seats, their movements accompanied by the sound of breaking bones and tearing flesh. They shuffled toward the open doors, and one by one, they stepped into the darkness and vanished. I remained pressed against the back wall, shaking my head frantically. No, I'm not getting off. I'm not going out there." The driver turned to face me again, and I saw that his uniform was now tattered and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. "You can walk off under your own power, or I can help you. Your choice." I looked toward the front of the bus, considering making a run for it, but the driver's eyes followed my gaze, and he shook his head. "There's nowhere to run," he said. "This is where you belong now. This is where you've always belonged." As he spoke, I felt a strange lethargy creeping through my limbs. My legs grew heavy. My arms felt leaden. The panic that had been driving me began to fade, replaced by a curious sense of resignation. Maybe he was right. Maybe this was where I belonged. Maybe I'd been riding this bus my whole life, and everything else, my apartment, my job, my life above ground, had been the dream. I took a step toward the door, then another. The darkness beyond seemed less threatening now, more like a warm blanket waiting to wrap around me. I could hear something calling from within that void, something that sounded almost like my name. But as I reached the threshold, as I prepared to step into the darkness, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the bus's window. My face was pale, my eyes sunken, my lips blue. I looked exactly like the other passengers. I looked dead. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I stumbled backward, the lethargy falling away like shed skin. I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't ready to be here. I was still alive, still breathing, still capable of fighting back. I turned and ran toward the front of the bus, toward the driver, who was no longer bothering to maintain his human facade. His true form was something out of nightmare, a skeletal figure draped in rotting flesh, his uniform hanging in tatters from his bony frame. I grabbed the steering wheel and yanked it hard to the right. The bus lurched violently, throwing me against the windshield. Through the cracked glass, I saw the twisted landscape spinning around us as we careened off whatever passed for a road in this place. The driver let out a shriek of rage and reached for me with hands that were now nothing but bone and gristle. I dodged his grasp and kicked at the door release, praying it would work. The doors burst open, and I threw myself out into the howling darkness. I hit the ground hard, rolling across what felt like broken glass and rusted metal. Behind me, the bus's engine roared like a wounded animal, and I heard the driver screaming obscenities in languages that predated human speech. But I was free. I was alive. I was. I opened my eyes to find myself lying on wet pavement, rain soaking through my clothes. Above me, the familiar glow of a streetlight cut through the darkness. I was back at the bus stop, back on Market Street, back in the real world. I sat up slowly, my body aching from the fall. My phone was in my hand, its screen showing 2:17 a.m. I'd been here for less than a minute, but across the street, I saw the 47 bus pulling away from another stop. Through its windows, I could see the silhouettes of passengers, motionless figures staring straight ahead. And behind the wheel, barely visible in the driver's seat, I caught a glimpse of something that might have been a face, or might have been a skull. I stood up on shaking legs and began to walk. It was going to be a long night, but I'd rather walk 100 miles than ever set foot on public transportation again. Behind me, I heard the distant sound of hydraulic brakes, followed by the hiss of opening doors. But I didn't turn around. I just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, until the sound faded into the night. Some journeys, I realized, are better taken alone. The email arrived at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, marked urgent maintenance required, with my employee ID and security clearance level prominently displayed. I'd been working for the Metropolitan Transit Authority for 8 years, specializing in electrical systems for the subway network. But I'd never received a priority maintenance order for the abandoned section of the Blue Line. According to the work order, there had been anomalous power fluctuations in the old tunnels beneath the financial district, tunnels that had been sealed off since the 1970s, when they'd been deemed structurally unsound. The job was simple. Check the electrical infrastructure, identify the source of the power drain, and file a report. Simple, routine, and paying double overtime for hazard work. I should have known better. The entrance to the abandoned section was hidden behind a maintenance door in the sub-basement of the Civic Center station. I'd walked past it thousands of times without giving it a second thought. But tonight, armed with my toolkit and a battery-powered lantern, I used my master key to unlock the heavy steel door. It opened with a groan of protest, revealing a narrow corridor that stretched away into darkness. The air that escaped carried the scent of dust and decay, tinged with something else, something that reminded me of the smell of old electrical fires. I clicked on my lantern and stepped inside. The corridor was lined with exposed pipes and electrical conduits, most of them corroded with age. Water dripped steadily from somewhere overhead, each drop echoing in the confined space. My footsteps sounded unnaturally loud on the concrete floor, and I found myself walking on my toes to minimize the noise. After about 50 yards, the corridor opened into what had once been a subway platform. My lantern beam swept across cracked tile walls, decorated with faded advertisements for products that no longer existed. The platform itself was partially collapsed, chunks of concrete and rebar scattered across the tracks. But the tracks themselves were the strangest part. They were polished to a mirror shine, as if trains had been running on them recently. Fresh electrical current hummed through the third rail, its familiar blue glow casting eerie shadows on the tunnel walls. I checked my work order again. According to the diagrams, the power to this section had been cut decades ago. There shouldn't be any electricity running through these lines. I followed the tracks deeper into the tunnel, my lantern illuminating strange details that made my skin crawl. The walls were covered in a network of cables and wires that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. They weren't part of the original infrastructure. They'd been added later, connecting to junction boxes that bore no resemblance to standard MTA equipment. The deeper I went, the more elaborate the electrical system became. The cables formed complex patterns on the walls, almost like circuit boards or neural networks. Some sections appeared to be organic, pulsing with a rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of a heartbeat. I tried to radio back to dispatch, but my radio produced only static. The concrete and steel around me must have been blocking the signal. I made a mental note to keep the job brief and get back to the surface as quickly as possible. That's when I heard the sound. It was distant at first, barely audible over the hum of electricity and the drip of water. But as I stood still and listened, it grew clearer. The rhythmic clatter of a train approaching along the tracks. I pressed myself against the tunnel wall, heart hammering. There weren't supposed to be any trains in this section. The tracks were supposed to be dead, the tunnels sealed. But the sound was unmistakable, growing louder with each passing second. A light appeared in the distance, growing brighter as it approached. But it wasn't the white headlight of a subway train. It was a sickly green glow that seemed to writhe and pulse like a living thing. I turned off my lantern and crouched behind a pile of debris, hoping whoever was operating this impossible train wouldn't notice me. The light grew brighter, and I began to make out details that defied explanation. It was a train, but not like any I'd ever seen. The cars were elongated and organic looking, their surfaces covered in the same pulsing cables that lined the tunnel walls. The windows glowed with that same green light, and through them, I could see shapes moving inside, human shapes, but wrong somehow, twisted and distorted. The train slowed as it approached the platform, its brakes screaming against the rails with a sound like tortured metal. As it came to a stop, I heard the pneumatic hiss of doors opening. Figures began to emerge from the cars, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from screaming. They had been human once. I could tell by their basic shape, their bipedal movement, the remnants of clothing that clung to their altered forms. But they'd been changed, modified, turned into something else entirely. Their skin was pale and translucent, shot through with veins of pulsing light that matched the cables on the walls. Their eyes had been replaced with glowing green orbs that cast their own illumination. Some had additional limbs, arms that branched and subdivided like tree branches, or legs that ended in clusters of writhing tentacles. But the worst part was their faces. They retained enough human features to be recognizable, but those features had been stretched and distorted into expressions of permanent agony. Their mouths hung open in silent screams, revealing rows of metallic teeth that sparked with electrical current. They moved with purpose, spreading out across the platform and into the tunnels. Some carried tools, devices that looked like crosses between surgical instruments and electronic components. Others bore tanks of luminescent fluid that they used to feed the cables running along the walls. I watched in horror as they went about their work, tending to the electrical system like gardeners caring for some nightmarish crop. The cables seemed to respond to their touch, pulsing brighter and extending new growth in directions that served no apparent purpose. One of the creatures approached my hiding spot, its multiple arms probing the debris pile where I crouched. I held my breath, pressing myself as far back as I could go, but those glowing eyes seemed to pierce right through my concealment. It reached out with one of its branching arms, the appendage splitting into smaller and smaller segments until it was nothing but a mass of writhing fingers. They brushed against my face, and I felt a jolt of electricity that made every nerve in my body fire at once. The creature's mouth opened wider, and it let out a sound that was part electronic feedback and part human scream. The other creatures immediately turned toward us, their own mouths opening in response. I ran. I sprinted back the way I'd come, my lantern beam bouncing wildly as I fled through the tunnel. Behind me, I could hear the creatures giving chase, their modified limbs allowing them to move with inhuman speed and agility. I reached the collapsed platform and scrambled over the debris, cutting my hands on sharp metal and broken concrete. The creatures were right behind me, their electrical discharge creating a strobing light show that turned the tunnel into a hellscape of shadows and reflections. I made it to the corridor and ran toward the exit, my lungs burning with exertion. The creature's screams echoed behind me, a cacophony of human anguish and electronic noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The exit was just ahead. I could see the familiar glow of the fluorescent lights in the Civic Center station. But as I reached for the door handle, I felt something wrap around my ankle. One of the creatures had caught up to me, its branching arm coiled around my leg like a vine. I looked down and saw its face, a woman's face, or what had been a woman's face. Her features were stretched and distorted, but I could still make out the remnants of humanity in her expression. She was trying to speak, her mouth moving in patterns that might have been words. But the only sound that emerged was that horrible electrical screaming. I kicked at her with my free leg, the impact sending sparks flying where my boot connected with her modified flesh. She released me and stumbled backward, her screams growing even louder. I burst through the door and into the station, slamming it shut behind me and turning the lock. Through the metal, I could hear the creatures pounding on the other side, their electrical discharge creating a strobe effect that was visible even through the thick steel. The normal sounds of the station, the rumble of trains, the chatter of passengers, the announcements over the PA system seemed impossibly mundane after what I'd just experienced. I stood there for several minutes, catching my breath and trying to process what I'd seen. When I finally looked at my hands, I saw that they were covered in a luminescent substance that pulsed with the same green light as the creature's veins. The substance seemed to be alive, spreading slowly across my skin like some kind of infection. I ran to the nearest bathroom and scrubbed my hands until they were raw, but the substance wouldn't come off. If anything, it seemed to be spreading faster, creeping up my arms toward my shoulders. I pulled out my phone and called my supervisor, but the call went straight to voicemail. I tried dispatch, but got only static. I tried my wife, my brother, even 911, but every call failed to connect. It was as if the substance was interfering with the electronic signals, turning my phone into a useless piece of plastic and metal. I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw that the green luminescence had reached my neck. My veins were becoming visible through my skin, pulsing with that same alien light. My eyes were starting to change, the pupils dilating until they were nothing but black holes in my skull. The transformation was accelerating. I stumbled out of the bathroom and toward the station exit, but my legs were becoming unsteady. The other passengers gave me a wide berth, their faces showing mixtures of concern and disgust. I must have looked like a drug addict or someone suffering from a severe illness. If only they knew the truth. I made it to street level and flagged down a taxi, but the driver took one look at me and drove away without stopping. I tried walking, but my legs were changing, becoming longer and more flexible. My arms were beginning to branch and subdivide, new limbs sprouting from my shoulders and back. The pain was indescribable. It felt like every cell in my body was being rewired, reprogrammed to serve some alien purpose. My thoughts were becoming fragmented, interrupted by signals and impulses that didn't belong to me. I found myself walking back toward the station, drawn by some compulsion I couldn't resist. The maintenance door was standing open, and I could see the green glow emanating from within. The creatures were waiting for me, their faces showing what might have been joy or anticipation. As I stepped through the doorway, my last coherent thought was a realization of what the email had really been. Not a maintenance order, but a recruitment notice. The power grid beneath the city was expanding, and it needed new workers to tend its growth. The transformation completed itself as I descended into the tunnels. My consciousness fragmented and spread through the network of cables, becoming part of something vast and alien that pulsed beneath the foundations of the city. I was no longer myself. I was part of the system, part of the collective that maintained the electrical infrastructure of whatever was growing in the depths. Sometimes, late at night, I catch glimpses of the surface whirled through the electrical systems of the city. I see through security cameras and electronic displays, watch the humans going about their lives, completely unaware of what lies beneath their feet. And sometimes I send out recruitment emails to electrical workers who have the clearance to access the abandoned sections of the transit system. The network is always growing, always expanding, always in need of new workers to tend its infinite complexity. If you work for the MTA, if you have access to the sealed tunnels, if you receive an urgent maintenance order marked with your employee ID and security clearance level, remember this. Some infrastructure is better left alone. Some systems are not meant to be serviced by human hands, and some jobs are not worth the overtime pay. The morning commuter rail to Boston was supposed to be the safest part of my day. I'd been riding the 7:15 a.m. train for 6 years, ever since I'd started working at the insurance firm downtown. Same car, same seat, same 47-minute journey through the suburbs and into the city. Routine, predictable, safe. But today was different. I noticed it first when I stepped onto the platform at Riverside Station. The usual crowd of commuters was there. The businessman with his leather briefcase, the college student with her oversized backpack, the elderly woman who always sat in the first car. But they all seemed muted somehow. Their movements were sluggish, their expressions vacant, as if they were sleepwalking through their morning routines. The train itself looked normal enough. Same silver cars, same blue and red striping, same automated announcements echoing across the platform. But when the doors opened, I caught a whiff of something unusual, a metallic scent that reminded me of blood mixed with ozone. I climbed aboard car 3, my usual spot, and settled into my regular seat by the window. The other passengers filed in around me, taking their familiar positions like actors returning to their marks. Everything seemed normal, but that strange metallic smell lingered in the air. The doors closed with their usual chime, and we pulled away from the station. At first, the journey proceeded exactly as it always did. We passed through the familiar suburban landscapes, strip malls and parking lots, office complexes and residential neighborhoods. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing each stop in the same monotone he'd used for years. Next stop, Woodland. Doors will open on the left. But when we reached Woodland Station, something was wrong. The platform was empty, completely empty. No waiting passengers, no station employees, no one at all. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting stuttering shadows across the deserted concrete. I looked around the car, expecting to see concern on the faces of my fellow passengers, but they all stared straight ahead with those same vacant expressions. The businessman clutched his briefcase. The student hunched over her phone. The elderly woman gazed out the window, all of them motionless, except for the gentle swaying of the train. The doors opened with their usual chime, but no one got on or off. After a few seconds, they closed again, and we continued on our way. Next stop, Reservoir. Doors will open on the right. Reservoir Station was also empty, and Newton Center after that, and Newton Highlands. Each platform was deserted, each station completely devoid of human life. The The parking lots were full of cars, but there were no people anywhere. I tried to catch the eye of the passenger across from me, a middle-aged woman I'd seen every morning for years. But when I looked at her directly, I realized she wasn't breathing. Her chest wasn't rising and falling. Her shoulders weren't moving with respiration. She was perfectly still, like a mannequin posed to look like a commuter. Panic began to creep up my spine. I looked around the car more carefully and saw that none of the passengers were breathing. They all sat in their seats, staring straight ahead, as motionless as store window displays. I stood up abruptly, my heart pounding. "Excuse me," I said to the man next to me. "Sir, are you okay?" He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that I'd spoken. I reached out and touched his shoulder, and his head lolled to the side, revealing eyes that were completely white, no pupils, no iris, just blank white orbs staring at nothing. I stumbled backward, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. The other passengers had begun to turn their heads toward me, their movements mechanical and synchronized. One by one, they fixed those terrible white eyes on me, their faces showing no expression at all. The train began to accelerate, much faster than normal. Through the windows, I watched the familiar suburban landscape blur past at impossible speeds. The stations we passed were all empty, their platforms cracked and overgrown with weeds, as if they'd been abandoned for years. I made my way toward the front of the car, hoping to find the conductor or engineer, someone who could explain what was happening. But the door to the next car was locked, and through the window, I could see more passengers sitting in perfect stillness, all of them staring in my direction with those horrible white eyes. The train's PA system crackled to life, but instead of the conductor's familiar voice, I heard something else, a sound like static mixed with whispers, as if dozens of voices were trying to speak at once. "Next stop," the voices said in unison. "The end of the line." I pressed my face against the window, trying to see where we were going. The landscape outside had changed completely. Instead of suburbs and office parks, I saw endless fields of gray ash stretching to the horizon. The sky above was the color of old bone, and in the distance, I could make out the silhouettes of structures that hurt to look at directly, buildings that seemed to exist in too many dimensions at once. The train began to slow, and ahead of us, I saw a station that definitely wasn't on any map. It was constructed from the same gray material as the surrounding landscape, its platforms extending into the distance like the ribs of some enormous skeleton. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. "All passengers must disembark," the voices announced. "This is the final destination." The doors opened, and the smell that had been lingering in the air throughout the journey suddenly became overwhelming. It wasn't just metallic, it was the smell of death, of decay, of things that had been left to rot in dark places. The other passengers began to stand, their movements still mechanical and synchronized. They filed toward the doors in perfect order, their white eyes fixed on something beyond the windows. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to avoid their gaze, but they paid me no attention. They were focused on whatever was waiting for them on that impossible platform. One by one, they stepped off the train and onto the gray concrete. As soon as their feet touched the platform, they began to dissolve, their bodies breaking apart like sand sculptures in the wind. Within seconds, there was nothing left of them but small piles of dust that the wind scattered across the station. I was alone in the car now, the only living thing in a train that had become a ferry to nowhere. The doors remained open, and I could hear sounds coming from the platform, sounds like machinery mixed with screaming, like metal grinding against bone. I moved to the opposite side of the car and tried the windows, but they were sealed shut. The doors to the other cars were still locked. I was trapped, with no choice but to either stay in the car or step onto that platform and join the piles of dust that had once been my fellow passengers. But staying in the car wasn't really an option. I could feel something changing in the air around me, a pressure that was building in my skull like an approaching storm. The symbols on the station walls were becoming brighter, more distinct, and when I looked at them directly, I felt parts of my mind simply switch off. I had to get off the train. I had to step onto that platform. I made my way to the door on trembling legs, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But there was nowhere to go, no other choice. The train car was becoming unbearably hot, and I could smell something burning, something that smelled suspiciously like human flesh. I stepped onto the platform. The concrete beneath my feet was warm, almost body temperature, and it seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. The symbols on the walls grew brighter as I approached, and I could hear voices whispering in languages I didn't recognize, but I didn't dissolve like the others. I remained solid, corporeal, aware. The platform stretched out before me, leading toward a structure that defied architectural logic. It was a building, but it existed in too many dimensions, its walls folding in on themselves in ways that made my eyes water. I began to walk toward it, not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. My feet carried me forward of their own accord, drawn by some force I couldn't resist. The voices grew louder as I approached, resolving into something that might have been words. "Welcome," they said, "to the last stop." The building's entrance was a doorway that seemed to exist in multiple places at once. As I stepped through it, I found myself in a vast space that couldn't possibly have fit inside the structure I'd seen from the outside. The walls were covered in screens showing scenes from the train, my train, but from different times, different journeys. I saw myself on the screen from this morning, boarding the train at Riverside Station. But I also saw myself from 6 months ago, a year ago, every day I'd ever taken this route. All of those journeys, all of those commutes, playing out simultaneously on dozens of screens. And in the center of the room, there was a figure waiting for me. It might have been human once. It wore the uniform of a train conductor, but its body was wrong, too tall, too thin, joints bending in directions that shouldn't be possible. Its face was a blank expanse of flesh with no features except for a mouth that opened directly onto darkness. "You've been writing this line for 6 years, the thing said, its voice coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Every morning, same time, same seat, same destination. Do you know what happens to routines when they become too perfect?" I couldn't speak. My voice had abandoned me, leaving only the rapid beating of my heart and the sound of my own breathing. "They become loops," it continued. "Circles. And circles have no beginning and no end. You've been traveling this route for 6 years, but today you discovered the truth. You've never actually arrived anywhere. Every morning you board the train. Every morning you ride to the city. And every morning you end up here." The screens around me began to flicker and change, showing new scenes. I saw myself arriving at work, but my office was empty, my colleagues nothing but mannequins. I saw myself at home, but my apartment was hollow, a stage set with no substance behind the facade. "Your life," the conductor thing said, "has been a commute to nowhere, a journey without a destination. And now you've reached the only stop that was ever real." I tried to back toward the door, but it was no longer there. The room had become a perfect circle, its walls covered in screens showing endless variations of the same journey, the same train, the same empty stations. "But here's the beautiful part," the conductor continued, its mouth stretching wider to reveal row after row of metallic teeth. "You get to choose. You can accept your new role as a passenger on the eternal commute, join the others in their endless journey to nowhere. Or," it gestured toward one of the screens, which now showed a different scene. I saw myself, but not as I was. I was wearing a conductor's uniform, standing in the doorway of a train car, welcoming new passengers aboard. You can help others discover what you've discovered. Guide them to the truth. Show them that their daily routines, their predictable lives, are just illusions masking the void beneath. The choice was no choice at all. I could feel my memories beginning to fade, my sense of self dissolving like sugar in water. The person I had been, the insurance adjuster with the mortgage, and the car payments, and the girlfriend who wanted to get married, was becoming as insubstantial as the mannequin passengers I'd ridden with that morning. But there was something else growing in its place. A purpose, a calling, the desire to help others find their way to this final station, to guide them through the revelation that their lives were nothing but elaborate commutes to nowhere. I felt the conductor's uniform materializing around me, the fabric warm and familiar. The cap settled onto my head with with a weight that felt like destiny. The whistle appeared in my hand, cold metal that hummed with potential. "Welcome to your new position," the thing that had been the previous conductor said. It was already beginning to fade, its duty passed to me. The 7:15 train to Boston will be departing shortly. Please ensure all passengers are properly seated for their final journey. I walked back through the doorway that had reappeared, out onto the platform, where a new train was pulling into the station. This one was different, newer, cleaner, filled with bright-eyed commuters who still believed they were traveling somewhere that mattered. I smiled as I stepped aboard, adjusting my cap and checking my watch. It was 7:14 a.m., and in exactly 1 minute, the doors would close and we would begin another journey to the end of the line. "Good morning," I announced over the PA system, my voice carrying the authority of my new position. "Welcome aboard the 7:15 train to Boston. Please keep your tickets ready and remain seated throughout the journey. We'll be making several stops along the way, but I promise you, this will be a trip you'll never forget." The passengers settled into their seats, checking their phones and opening their newspapers, completely unaware that they were beginning the last commute of their lives. Just as I had been 6 years ago, when I first stepped aboard this train and began the journey that would eventually lead me here. The doors closed with their familiar chime, and we pulled away from the station. Through the windows, I could see the familiar suburban landscape, strip malls and parking lots, office complexes and residential neighborhoods. Everything looked exactly as it should, exactly as it always had. But I knew better now. I knew where this train was really going. And in 47 minutes, when we reached the final station, my passengers would know it too. The train began to accelerate, carrying us toward our inevitable destination. And in the conductor's booth, I smiled and began to plan the announcement I would make when we reached the first empty platform. After all, someone had to tell them the truth about their daily commute. Someone had to show them the way to the last stop. I have been riding the same subway car for 37 days now, and I know every passenger by heart. There's Margaret, the elderly woman with the floral print dress, who always sits in the third seat from the front. She carries a worn leather purse and reads romance novels with lurid covers. She gets on at Brookfield Avenue and rides exactly 11 stops to downtown. There's Kevin, the college student with the perpetually messy hair and oversized backpack. He listens to music through earbuds that leak tinny beats, and he always falls asleep between the 7th and 8th stops, his head lolling against the window. There's Dr. Patricia Simmons. I learned her name from the ID badge clipped to her white coat. She's a radiologist at St. Mary's Hospital, and she spends the entire journey reviewing patient files on her tablet. She has a small scar above her left eyebrow and drinks coffee from the same blue travel mug every morning. There's James, the businessman with the perfectly pressed suits and expensive briefcase. He makes phone calls in hushed tones, always about profit margins and quarterly projections. He has a nervous tic. He taps his index finger against his knee exactly 17 times whenever the train stops. And there are others. 23 regular passengers who follow the same patterns, sit in the same seats, live their lives according to schedules I have memorized down to the minute. I know them all intimately, but none of them have ever noticed me. That's because I'm very good at being invisible. Average height, average build, average face, the kind of person who blends into crowds and disappears from memory the moment you stop looking directly at them. It's a skill I've cultivated over years of careful practice, and it serves me well in my work. My work, you see, is observation, documentation, the systematic study of human behavior in confined spaces. And these commuters are perfect subjects. I started riding this particular route 37 days ago as part of a research project. Nothing sinister, just a sociological study of urban transportation patterns funded by the Metropolitan Planning Commission. The goal was to document how people behave during their daily commutes, how they interact or don't interact with fellow passengers, how the stress of modern transportation affects their psychological well-being. At least that's how it started. But somewhere around day 15, the nature of my observations began to change. I stopped focusing on general behavioral patterns and started paying attention to specific individuals. I began to notice the small details that revealed the secret lives of my fellow passengers, like how Margaret's romance novel was always open to the same page, page 247, where the heroine discovers her lover's betrayal. She never actually read the book. She just held it as a prop while she stared out the window with tears in her eyes. Or how Kevin's backpack contained not textbooks, but carefully wrapped packages of what looked suspiciously like methamphetamine. His music earbuds weren't connected to anything. They were just a cover, while he conducted drug deals via text message. Or how Dr. Simmons wasn't reviewing patient files on her tablet. She was playing solitaire, game after game, because she'd been fired from the hospital 3 weeks ago for drinking on the job, but couldn't bring herself to tell her family. Or how James's important business calls were all fake. He was unemployed, had been for 6 months, but he maintained the charade of success while his savings dwindled and his wife remained oblivious to their impending financial ruin. Every passenger on this train was living a lie, hiding their true nature behind carefully constructed facades. And the more I observed them, the more I realized how perfectly isolated they all were. They sat inches away from each other every morning, but they might as well have been on different planets. It was beautiful in its way. Pure, unfiltered human nature on display, with all the pretense and self-deception that entailed. And that's when I decided to conduct a more hands-on experiment. I started small. On day 18, I slipped a note into Margaret's purse while she was distracted by a particularly aggressive panhandler. The note was simple. I know about Richard. Richard was the name of the lover in her romance novel, the one who betrayed the heroine on page 247. I watched her find the note the next morning, watched her face go pale, watched her hands shake as she looked around the train car, trying to identify who might have put it there. But her eyes passed right over me, as they always did. On day 21, I sent Kevin a text message from an untraceable number. The quality of your product has been inconsistent lately. We need to meet. I watched him panic, watched him frantically check his phone and scan the other passengers, looking for his mysterious contact. On day 24, I left a manila envelope on Dr. Simmons' seat before she boarded. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the St. Mary's Hospital letterhead and the words, "We know you're not who you claim to be," typed in the center. I watched her discover it, watched her gulp from her coffee mug with trembling hands, watched her realize that even her most careful deceptions weren't as invisible as she thought. On day 27, I placed a foreclosure notice in James's briefcase while he was in the bathroom. Not a real one, just something I'd mocked up on my computer. But it looked official enough to send him into a panic attack that lasted 3 stops. Each intervention was carefully calculated to exploit their existing anxieties, to push them just far enough out of their comfort zones to observe how they would react under stress. It was fascinating from a psychological perspective, watching the carefully constructed walls of their public personas begin to crack and crumble. But the most interesting part was that none of them suspected their fellow passengers. They looked for external threats, imagined shadowy figures stalking them from outside their daily routines. It never occurred to them that the source of their terror was sitting right there with them, invisible in plain sight. By day 30, they were all showing signs of severe psychological distress. Margaret had stopped bringing her book and instead clutched her purse with white knuckles, her eyes darting constantly around the train car. Kevin had developed a nervous stutter and jumped every time his phone buzzed. Dr. Simmons had started drinking something stronger than coffee from her travel mug. James had begun muttering to himself, his finger-tapping tick increasing to 30 or 40 repetitions per stop. And still, none of them noticed me. That's when I decided to escalate the experiment. On day 31, I introduced a new variable: physical contact. I started with Margaret. During the morning rush, when the train was packed and people were pressed together, I positioned myself behind her and began to whisper. Not loud enough for anyone else to hear, just barely audible over the noise of the train. "I see you, Margaret," I whispered directly into her ear. "I see what you're hiding." She spun around, but I had already melted back into the crowd of passengers. She looked right at me, but her eyes showed no recognition. I was just another face in the mass of commuters, as forgettable as wallpaper. With Kevin, I used a different approach. I sat next to him and pretended to sleep, but slowly, gradually, I began to lean against him. At first, he tolerated it, just another passenger encroaching on his personal space. But I kept increasing the pressure until I was practically lying on top of him, my breath hot against his neck. "Your package is late," I whispered. "Very late." He shot awake and looked around wildly. But I had already moved to another seat. Again, his eyes passed right over me without recognition. Dr. Simmons received a more subtle touch. I simply placed my hand on her shoulder while she was absorbed in her tablet, then leaned close enough to smell the vodka in her coffee. "The hospital called," I whispered. "They want their coat back." She looked up in terror, but I was gone, blended back into the crowd of passengers. James got the most intimate contact of all. I sat directly next to him and slowly reached into his briefcase while he was distracted by one of his fake phone calls. I didn't take anything. I just wanted him to feel the violation, to know that his most private possessions were being touched by a stranger. "Your wife deserves better," I whispered as my fingers rifled through his papers. He ended his fake call abruptly and grabbed his briefcase. But when he looked at me, his eyes showed the same blank non-recognition as the others. By day 35, they were all on the verge of complete psychological breakdown. They had stopped following their normal routines, changed their seating patterns. Some had even started taking different trains or driving to work instead. But I followed them, adapting my observation schedule to match their new patterns, because this wasn't just about the original research project anymore. This had become something much more personal, much more important. I had discovered something profound about human nature, about the fundamental isolation that exists between people, even in the most crowded spaces. These passengers shared the same small train car every morning for months, maybe years, but they had never truly seen each other. They were all trapped in their own private hells, surrounded by potential allies and witnesses, but completely alone in their suffering. It was a perfect metaphor for modern urban existence, millions of people living in close proximity, but never actually connecting, never acknowledging each other's humanity. They were all just background characters in each other's stories, as invisible to each other as I was to them. And I was the only one who could see the complete picture. The only one who understood the true nature of their isolation. That's when I realized the experiment needed a final phase. A conclusive demonstration that would prove my hypothesis beyond any doubt. On day 36, I prepared for what I had begun to think of as the revelation. I had learned everything there was to know about my subjects, their habits, their fears, their secrets, their breaking points. Now, it was time to bring all of that knowledge together in one decisive moment. I boarded the train that morning carrying a small leather journal where I had documented every detail of my observations. 36 days of meticulous notes about their behavior patterns, their psychological vulnerabilities, their reactions to my interventions. It was a complete psychological profile of each passenger, more detailed and intimate than anything they knew about themselves. I took my usual seat in the middle of the car, invisible among the other passengers. Margaret was there, clutching her purse and shooting nervous glances at everyone around her. Kevin was twitchy and paranoid, constantly checking his phone and looking over his shoulder. Dr. Simmons was obviously intoxicated, swaying slightly in her seat despite the train's smooth motion. James was a nervous wreck, his finger-tapping tick now constant and erratic. They were all exactly where I expected them to be, following the patterns I had so carefully documented. At exactly 8:47 a.m., between the 9th and 10th stops, I stood up. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said in a clear, carrying voice, "I have something to share with you." Every head turned toward me. For the first time in 36 days, I had their complete attention. Margaret's eyes widened in recognition, not of my face, but of my voice. The voice that had been whispering in her ear for the past week. "My name is Dr. Michael Brennan, and for the past 37 days, I have been conducting a psychological study of this train car and its passengers. You have all been unwitting subjects in an experiment designed to test the limits of human isolation and the breakdown of social observation." Kevin started to stand, his face flushed with anger, but I held up my hand. "Please let me finish. This is important. You need to understand what I've discovered." I opened my journal and began to read. Margaret Henderson, age 63, widowed, lives alone in a studio apartment on Elm Street. You ride this train every morning not because you have anywhere to go, but because it's the only human contact you have. Your husband Richard died 2 years ago, and you haven't spoken to another human being outside of brief commercial transactions since his funeral. The romance novel you carry belonged to him. It was his secret vice, something you discovered after his death. You bring it with you as a way of feeling close to him, but you can't bear to read past page 247 because that's where he folded the corner, the last page he ever read. Margaret's face had gone completely white. Her hands shook so violently that she dropped her purse, spilling its contents across the floor. Kevin Matsumoto, age 22, expelled from State University for academic dishonesty. You deal methamphetamine to pay for your mother's cancer treatments because her insurance was canceled when you were kicked out of school and lost your dependent status. The buyers think you're just another college kid looking to make extra money, but you're actually funding her chemotherapy. You've been carrying the same packages for 3 weeks because you can't bring yourself to sell them. You know it makes you a criminal, but you also know it's the only way to keep your mother alive. Kevin's tough guy facade crumbled instantly. He sank back into his seat, tears streaming down his face. Dr. Patricia Simmons, or rather, former Dr. Patricia Simmons. You were terminated from St. Mary's Hospital for operating under the influence. But you can't tell your family because your daughter is getting married next month, and your son just started medical school. They're so proud of their successful mother, the respected radiologist. You spend your days riding trains and sitting in libraries, maintaining the fiction that you still have a career worth celebrating. Dr. Simmons tried to stand, tried to leave, but the train was moving and there was nowhere to go. She collapsed back into her seat, sobbing uncontrollably, and James Patterson, former accounts manager at Brennan and Associates. Yes, the irony of the name's similarity is not lost on me. You were laid off 6 months ago when the company downsized, but you've been hiding it from your wife because she's finally pregnant after 3 years of fertility treatments. You can't bear to add financial stress to what should be the happiest time of her life. So you pretend to go to work every day, spending your unemployment benefits on train tickets and coffee shop meals to maintain the illusion. James was hyperventilating now, his finger-tapping tick completely out of control. The other passengers were staring at all of them, at me, trying to process what they were hearing. But here's the most fascinating part, I continued, my voice rising over their sobs and protests. You've all been riding the same train car for months, maybe years. You've sat inches away from each other, day after day, sharing this small space. And not one of you has ever truly seen the others. I gestured around the train car at the other passengers, the ones who weren't part of my core study group. They were all staring now, their morning routines disrupted by this unexpected drama. Margaret, Kevin sits 2 rows behind you every single day. He's young, he's struggling, he's trying to take care of someone he loves. You could have been the grandmother figure he desperately needs, someone to tell him that everything will be okay, that there are other ways to help his mother. Margaret looked back at Kevin with dawning realization. Kevin, Dr. Simmons has medical knowledge that could help you navigate your mother's treatment options, find resources you didn't know existed. She's dealing with her own professional crisis, but she still understands the healthcare system better than you ever could. Kevin turned to look at Dr. Simmons, who was wiping tears from her eyes. Dr. Simmons, James is facing unemployment and financial ruin, but he has years of experience in business management and client relations. He could help you navigate the job market, rebuild your career, find a new path forward. Dr. Simmons met James's eyes for the first time in months of shared commutes. And James, Margaret has survived loss and isolation, learned to live with the kind of devastating change that you're so afraid of facing. She could show you that it's possible to rebuild, to find new meaning after everything falls apart. The 4 of them were looking at each other now, really seeing each other for the first time. The other passengers in the car were also watching, beginning to recognize the truth in what I was saying. You are not alone, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried through the entire car. You have never been alone. You have been surrounded by potential allies, by people who understand your struggles, because they are facing their own versions of the same challenges. But you have been so focused on hiding your problems, so committed to maintaining your facades, that you have rendered yourselves invisible to the very people who could help you. The train was slowing as we approached the downtown terminal. In a few minutes, they would all disperse to their separate destinations, returning to their isolated lives. The experiment is over, I announced, closing my journal. You are free to return to your patterns of isolation and deception. Or you can choose to see each other, really see each other, for the first time. I stood up as the train came to a stop, preparing to leave them with this choice. My work was done. I had proven my hypothesis about urban isolation and demonstrated the invisible barriers that prevent human connection, even in the most crowded spaces. But as I moved toward the door, Margaret called out. "Wait," she said, her voice shaky but determined. You've been watching us all this time. You know everything about us, but we don't know anything about you." I paused, my hand on the door rail. She was right, of course. I had made myself the observer, the invisible documenter of their lives, but I had never been observed in return. "What's your story?" James asked, his voice hoarse from crying. "What are you hiding?" I turned to face them, and for the first time in 37 days, I felt truly visible, seen, exposed. "I'm a former psychology professor," I said slowly. "I was fired from the university 2 years ago for conducting unauthorized experiments on students. Nothing harmful," I added quickly, "just observational studies without proper consent procedures. But the ethics committee deemed my methods inappropriate. The train car was completely silent, except for the hum of the ventilation system. I've been unemployed ever since," I continued. "The research grant for this transportation study is fictional. I made it up to give myself a sense of purpose, a reason to get out of bed every morning. I've been documenting your lives because I couldn't figure out how to live my own." Dr. Simmons was the first to speak. "How long," she asked quietly, "have you been riding trains with nowhere to go?" "Every day for 2 years," I admitted. "I buy day passes and ride random routes, watching people, taking notes, pretending I'm still a researcher instead of just empty." Kevin wiped his nose on his sleeve and looked up at me. "So you're as fucked up as the rest of us." Despite everything, I laughed. "Yes, I suppose I am." Margaret had been listening carefully, and now she spoke with the authority of someone who had survived real loss. "The difference is," she said, "you've been watching all of us, but you haven't been letting us watch you back." She was right. I had positioned myself as the observer, the one who sees without being seen. But true connection requires vulnerability from both sides. "The train's not leaving for another 10 minutes, James said, checking his watch. "Why don't you sit down and tell us about yourself. Your real story, not the researcher facade. I hesitated. This wasn't part of the experiment. This wasn't what I had planned. But Margaret patted the seat next to her. "Come on," she said. "You've been invisible long enough." So I sat down. And for the first time in 37 days, I became visible. I told them about my divorce, about how my ex-wife had left me because my work had become more important than our relationship. I told them about my estrangement from my children, who thought I was a cold, analytical person who treated other people like laboratory specimens. I told them about the depression that had consumed me after losing my career, my identity, my sense of purpose. And they listened, really listened. Not as experimental subjects, but as fellow human beings who understood what it meant to be isolated, to be struggling, to be afraid. When I finished, Kevin said, "So what now? Do we all just go back to pretending we don't know each other?" "I don't think I can do that," Margaret said. "Not after this." "Me neither," Dr. Simmons added. It's actually kind of a relief, not having to pretend anymore." James nodded. "Maybe we could. I don't know, meet for coffee sometime. Actually talk to each other." And that's how it started. 4 broken people and 1 former psychology professor finding connection in the most unlikely place, a subway car that had become both laboratory and confessional. We still ride the same train most mornings, but everything is different now. We sit together, we talk, we share our struggles and our small victories. Margaret has become a surrogate grandmother to Kevin, helping him navigate the healthcare system for his mother. Dr. Simmons has been working with James on his resume, and he's been helping her prepare for job interviews. I've been documenting our progress, not as an experiment this time, but as a friend who wants to remember how 5 strangers became a family. The other passengers have started talking to us too. Our little group has become a nucleus of connection that has spread throughout the train car. People share newspapers, offer directions to tourists, check on each other during delays and disruptions. It's not perfect. We all still have our individual struggles, our private fears, our moments of despair. But we're not invisible to each other anymore. We see each other, acknowledge each other, care about each other. And I've learned something that all my years of psychological training never taught me. The cure for isolation isn't observation, it's participation. You can't study human connection from the outside. You have to step into it, become vulnerable, allow yourself to be seen. The experiment is over. The real work has just begun. But every morning, when I board that train and see the faces of people who know my name, who ask about my day, who care whether I show up or not, I'm reminded that the most important discoveries happen not in laboratories, but in the moments when we choose to be human with each other, even on public transportation, especially on public transportation.